Chapter 16. June 1967, Livermore, California. John pulled up in front of his townhouse, about 12 miles from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and turned the car off. For a minute, he sat and stared at it. An early 20th century house with a high, sloping roof, jutting over the rough cast walls and horizontal beams set above the windows. A sliver of moon hung overhead, looking pale and unsteady in the darkening sky. The pebble path to the front porch was set at an angle. Suddenly, he found himself thinking of Zoe. She had told him once that an angled path was good feng shui, because it kept the qi, the wind of the universe, from entering the house too harshly. He had envisioned a new life with Marion in this house, but somehow true happiness seemed to continually elude him. He closed the door gently behind him to keep it from slamming. He didn't want to disturb Marion. Even so, she called out to him, "John, is that you?" "Yes, honey. Where are you?" "In the bedroom. Please come up and help me." Her voice sounded fretful, and his stomach dropped. What now? He remembered she'd been especially quiet that morning when he left, and he had thought she'd stayed up a little too late with her friends last night. "Okay, I'm coming," he called back, tossing the Los Angeles Times and his briefcase on the sofa before heading upstairs. For the first 3 years together, they had been happy. Their apartment in LA was small, but had enough space to entertain a few friends. John felt he was making a fresh start with his research. Marion loved her job at the elementary school, and they had enough money to enjoy the occasional movie or ballet on the weekends. Sometimes they played tennis, although she didn't really like it. The day he came home and she told him she was pregnant, they had immediately started making plans. She quit her job and encouraged him to take up an employment offer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, thinking the small-town atmosphere would be a better place to raise their children. The house was big for just 2 of them, but they didn't mind. They wanted enough space for the family to expand. Marion threw herself into refurbishing the old house, re-oiling all the wooden panels and trim, painting the walls, finding just the right furnishing for the nursery. Toys, books, and decorations were neatly arranged around the crib and changing table. Then, barely a month before her due date, their perfect world disintegrated. John had come home to find Marion huddled on the floor of the nursery, weeping uncontrollably. The baby was dead inside of her, but she could not let it go. Afterwards, she focused all her energy on conceiving again, tracking her fertile periods, modifying her diet, restricting activities, but to no avail. As months passed, she became more and more moody and temperamental. She kept the nursery as it was, ready and waiting, only adding 1 blue and 1 pink bootie, meticulously positioned on the little white dresser. Now John walked by the nursery door without a glance. In their spacious bedroom, bags and clothes were strewn everywhere. Marion sat on the bed, pushing ineffectually on the top of a suitcase that bulged with clothes. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, when John came in. "I can't get it closed." "Honey, what are you doing?" "I'm going back to Los Angeles." "We already talked about this, remember? We'll go together next month, when I get time off from work." Marion slid off the bed and stamped her foot like a child. "No, I want to go now. You can join me later." "Why?" "I'm bored here. I have to get out of this town." "Honey, you know you can invite neighbors over for tea, or go to a movie with Susie. You don't need to lock yourself in the house." "I hate these gossiping neighbors. I hate this small-town syndrome. There's nothing to talk about besides other people's business." Anyway, Susie's gone off to Boston to visit her mother. Raised in Los Angeles, Marion was a city girl. She loved shopping, dining out, going to the theater and movies. Even before the miscarriage, she'd suffered occasional bouts of boredom and depression. John took her hand and stroked it and then wiped the tears away. "Why don't we go out for dinner tonight? We can go see a movie at the drive-in afterwards," he soothed. She shook her head. "No, I already called a taxi. It'll be here at 8:30, so I can catch the 9:30 plane." "Without asking me?" He dropped her hand in surprise. "Just let me go, won't you? I'm sure you're sick of my whining and crying. You'll be much happier without me." "Have I ever said a word to make you think that?" "I know you don't love me anymore," she said, her voice strained. "You're always looking at babies on the street. Last Sunday you went on and on and on about Lydia and her new daughter, how sweet and attractive they both are. I can tell. You'd be much happier with another woman. Because I can't give you a baby." The last words came out in a wail, and she collapsed back on the bed in another bout of sobbing. "I can be happy without a baby, but not without you, Marion. Honey, come here." He sat on the bed and put his arm around her, but she turned away from him. "Don't deny it. You even suggested we adopt a baby and give up on having our own." She dragged the suitcase off the bed, put one foot on top, and yanked on the zipper. "I thought that might help ease your pain. I never meant it to upset you, and I did apologize immediately." He looked at her lugging the suitcase toward the door, hesitating only a few seconds, and then grabbing her arm and begged, "Honey, please, don't go. You're breaking my heart." She looked at him through watery eyes. Though tightly pinched together, her lips trembled. She loved him. His gentleness, his romantic touch, his maturity and generosity. How she longed to please him as a complete woman and give him children. But she had failed. The taxi driver knocked on the door just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, John on her heels. She kissed him on the cheek, said, "I'm sorry," and quickly turned away. John stood still and put his fingers on the spot where the touch of her full, soft lips still lingered. He felt numb and wooden, unable to move. The taxi door slammed, and the roar of the engine trailed off like distant thunder. When he could no longer hear it, he sank down into the sofa, feeling hollow. The noise of the window blinds rattling in the wind woke him up. He shivered, momentarily distracted from the ache in his heart by the chill air and his empty stomach. Closing the window, he looked at his watch, considering. 10:30 p.m. Despite his hunger, he was in no mood to cook, so he made himself a sandwich. His thoughts full of Marion, he sat down on the sofa to eat and opened the Los Angeles Times. In his opinion, the newspaper focused too much on sports and entertainment, but Marion liked it. She said it kept her connected to the sophisticated metropolitan life she missed. Flipping through the sections, he paused when a photo on the international news page caught his eye. The caption read, "China successfully tested its first hydrogen bomb yesterday on the remote Qinghai Tibet Plateau in northern China. Chinese Communist leader Chairman Mao Zedong, above center, congratulated the team of nuclear scientists, claiming that this development will be a major contribution to the cause of world peace." John stared at the photo for a long time, transfixed. In the front row, a slight, delicate woman reminded him of Zoe. How well he remembered those eyes and lips and smile. Only the military uniform and the hair cropped short under the army cap, distorted the image in his mind. If it was Zoe, she was still alive and building nuclear weapons. God, what a horrible thought. She chose bombs over me? John cried in disgust. He shook his head abruptly to dispel the thought of such an unthinkable betrayal. Goosebumps prickled his arms. He got up and poured himself a glass of whiskey, downing it in one gulp, and quickly poured himself another before returning to the photo. But that doesn't sound like her at all, he thought. She was from an intellectual family, fundamentally against violence and war. Unless she'd been forced into joining the research project. Or maybe the shift was patriotism. Perhaps the Chinese government had brainwashed her. Although she had strong moral principles, Zoe had never been especially political. She would sacrifice herself for her beliefs, as she had when she'd returned to China 17 years earlier. And if the communist indoctrination had swayed her, she might have chosen to stay. But with her brilliant mind, she could contribute so much more to the world than nuclear bombs. What a waste. He sat back, sipping at his whiskey, and furrowed his brow as the memories came flooding back. Her last letters to him had spoken of worry, frustration, even dissatisfaction with the political situation. Something, or someone powerful, must have changed her mind. His hand tightened around the glass. Who was the bastard who indoctrinated her, twisted her compassion into destruction? China saw the power of nuclear weapons as a way to win the Cold War, just like the US and Russia. The Chinese people lived in fear of nuclear catastrophe, as did the rest of the world. That must be the reason. And the result was that no one felt safe anymore. He swore under his breath, wishing he'd kidnapped her, kept her from leaving. Then they would have been happy all these years instead of living on opposite sides of the political divide. Her caught up amid political turmoil and him trapped in a failed marriage. He laughed out loud at this fantasy. He loved Marion now. Seeing the photo of Zoe had warped his thinking, distorted his emotions by resurrecting a past he knew he could never reclaim. Sprawled on the sofa, he stared up at the ceiling. The more he tried to sort out his tangled emotions, the more confused he grew. The watch on his wrist read 1:45 when he finally slipped into sleep. When he woke up, a few hours later, stiff and sore, it took him a few minutes to muster the strength to stand up and make a cup of coffee. He sat, rubbing his arms and flexing his ankles to get the blood flowing again. Fingers and toes tingled as he welcomed the burn that seemed to bring him back to life, despite the gaping void he felt inside. He knew that ache, recognized it as the love he still felt for Zoe, buried deep inside for so long. He picked the newspaper up off the floor and looked at the photo again. The woman, dressed in the army uniform, had a similar build to Zoe. Even her distinctive facial features, with a slightly curved upper lip, were all too familiar. It was Zoe, he decided. Everything fits together too well to be a coincidence. Obviously, she was happy, smiling and celebrating her achievement, her successful career and political life. She had changed. Their life together, the love they shared, was over. He put the newspaper down on the table, smoothing his hand across the newsprint like a caress, feeling the bitterness, regret, and anger drain out of his fingers. He couldn't hate her or himself any longer. It was time to move on. Filled with new hope and resolve, he went upstairs to get dressed. The clothes Marion had left behind were still scattered around the bedroom, and the sight brought him back to the reality of his responsibilities to her. Setting his jaw, he rummaged in his wardrobe until he found the leather keepsake box. It felt strange to open it after nearly a decade untouched. As his fingers flipped through the photos and letters from Zoe, he felt the ache inside him dissolving. The emptiness that had kept him discontented from his life vanished. As with a sad smile, he put everything in a plastic bag. He sorted out his next steps while fixing himself a quick breakfast. First, he had to go to the lab to take care of some paperwork and tell his boss. Then, he'd fly to Los Angeles to be with Marion. She was all he had. She'd come into his life at his lowest point. Her youth, energy, and love gave him the hope and courage to start a new life. He loved her, and he'd promised Harry he would take care of his sister, because he owed them his life ever since they'd saved him from that mob of protesters at the railway station all those years ago. Without even stopping to check the time, he picked up the phone to apologize for his failure. Harry listened without interruption, and when John was done, he said calmly, "Silly girl. She's still acting like a teenager, impulsive and emotional. Don't worry, she'll be fine." "How can you be so sure?" "This isn't the first time. I've seen these fits of temper before, and she always gets over them," Harry reassured him. To distract John, he changed the subject. "Did you see? China succeeded in detonating their first nuclear bomb. What do you think about that?" Surprised and a little worried. With an effort, John pushed Zoe's face to the back of his mind. How do you suppose the Chinese could succeed so quickly, without any help from Russia? Especially considering how poor they are. And if they can do that, you know they'll master the neutron bomb before long. Then what do we do? Invent yet another super bomb to beat that? Where does this all end? Yes, that's a real concern. President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program was a good policy, but since 1953, we haven't been proactive enough. First France, now China, and India is on its way too. They were humiliated in the territorial war with China in 1962. This test will only make them work harder to catch up. John rubbed his neck. I still think we should have banned nuclear technology right after World War II ended, before any other countries mastered the technology. If the reason for inventing the bomb was to win the war against the Axis powers, then what is our excuse for continuing to develop the technology now? We can't wind the clock back. The world needs an organization under the UN umbrella that has the power to monitor the industry and eliminate existing nuclear weapons. The technology should be used for peace only, not war. John spoke without thinking, amazed at the words he heard himself saying. It reminded him of when he and Zoe had signed a petition for the elimination of nuclear weapons at Berkeley University in 1946. She'd held his hand and said solemnly, I'm glad the bombs finally stopped Japanese military ambitions and the slaughter of Chinese people by Japanese soldiers, but I don't want to see the bomb used again. It's too powerful, and it can destroy the whole world. But now, almost 20 years later, she had apparently not only changed her mind, but became a crusader for the weapons development in China. We should make those scientists, the ones who think they have the power to destroy the world, feel ashamed of their ambition, he muttered. What do you mean? John hesitated only a second. I think maybe I need to be working to eliminate nuclear weapons. My work at Livermore is interesting and useful, but it doesn't stop nuclear proliferation. The more I study the effects of nuclear radiation, the more I hate the war, the weapons themselves, and the more I want to keep it from happening again. Marion leaving has opened my eyes to everything that's wrong in my life. It's time for me to move on. Don't worry about Marion. She'll calm down. But you need to do what you think is right. John hung up the phone, determined to get his life back on track.